Hey everyone, it's Ryan from Arcade High, back again with another Synthwave series tutorial, and today we are going over automation. Now, Patrick and I have a love-hate relationship with automation, because it can give a lot of life and depth to your tracks, but it can also get very overwhelming and confusing at times when you have dozens of tracks and tons of automation. Now, we'll start simple, and I'll try to move through this as quickly and as thoroughly as I can, just to get the basics down, and then we'll move into some practical stuff a little bit later. So to explain automation, it is just essentially allowing you to move parameters in and out or up and down throughout your tracks, whether that's volume, panning, or pretty much any of the knobs or sliders on your built-in plugins and third-party plugins. So I just have this little chord progression loop here. I'll play it for you real quick. All right, so let's say we want this second half to go down in volume, and that's where our automation will come into play. So if I press A on the keyboard, it'll bring up our automation view. And we can see that we're looking at volume per this little drop-down menu here. And you see this gray line going across. We're at minus 10 dB here. And if I click anywhere in this track, it'll activate automation on that track. And you may have noticed it turned this button green, and you'll see it down here as well. That's simply the track telling you, hey, I am reading automation on this track. It'll turn on automatically when you activate automation. And if you were to delete the automation, it will turn that button off. So now that we have this yellow line here, we can just click and create different nodes. And we can move these nodes around, left, right, up, and down. We can just grab lines, move them up and down. And then to delete them, you just double click a node, or you can click anywhere and drag to select multiples and then delete on the keyboard to remove them. So let's do what I mentioned before. We'll make this second half a little quieter. We'll create two nodes. We have an anchor point, drag this line down, and here we go. All right, so that's one way of doing automation. Now, if we go up to this drop-down menu over here, and you can also access it from down here as well, but we have a few other ways that we can create automation. There's touch, latch, and write. Now, I'm only going to go over touch and latch here. Write, you're probably not going to really ever use. In fact, I think if you turn it on for the first time, Logic tells you, hey, are you sure you want to use this? Because touch and latch are probably better options for you. But so touch, when I play this, I'm going to move my fader, and you will see it penciling in the automation as it plays. And so then, of course, you have like 1,000 different lines, and if you wanted to, you can come in here, click and drag to grab a bunch of the lines and smooth out your line or whatever. But so the other way would be latch. Now, with touch, when I change that, if you noticed, when I stopped moving the fader, it stopped penciling in the automation. But now if we go over to latch, I'm going to do the same thing, but you'll notice that when I stop moving the fader, it's going to begin to overwrite whatever is left in the automation at whatever point I stop my fader. And so that it overwrote all that automation there. Now, typically, Patrick and I usually just keep our automation on read, and then we'll just have, just drop in some anchor points and move things around manually. But touch and latch will have an extra little fun bonus feature that we use most often, which I'll get to here in a minute. Let's bring this back to roughly where we had it. And now let's say we want to change a different parameter on a plugin. So I have this tape delay here. And let's say we want to change this third chord to add more feedback on our delay. So if we go up to this drop-down menu here, it brings up our automation list. And if we go down to tape delay, we can find our feedback option. And then there we go. We have tape delay feedback. Here's our gray line showing 16%, which you can see is 16% feedback. I can click anywhere to activate. And then now we have a different colored line. And then I can add my anchor points and bring up the feedback. And then you heard it delay out with more feedback in that little section there. And if you notice too, you can see the volume automation line is faintly in the background here because it's still reading the volume automation. So that's cool that you can do that, but sometimes you don't necessarily want to menu dive. I mean, if you look at like Chromaverb, for instance, it has a giant list of parameters you can change, and I've seen some that will go all the way down to the bottom of the screen, and it can just be kind of eye-rolling to stare at this giant list. So a much quicker way of changing a specific parameter in a plugin, and I'm just going to remove this automation by selecting it all so I can illustrate this a little easier, going back down to volume, so we only have volume automation, is you can use either touch or latch to then turn on the feedback so you instantly have the parameter you want. So we'll just jump over to touch here real quick, and then I'll play it and then move my feedback knob. And then there we go. It brought up the exact parameter I wanted. And then we can just delete these here, and then add our points, change whatever we want. Now, one major thing to note is if you're using touch or latch, make sure that when you are done, turn it back to read. Otherwise, if you are changing any parameters in any of the plugins or the volume, it's just going to start changing that as you're playing, and you won't realize that it's actually automating that data. And a key thing to note with automation, especially when it comes to volume, is if you have automation and you try and change a parameter, or say like the volume, while it's playing, it will not affect it from the fader here. So for instance, if I play this and try and turn it down, it's going to ignore that change I just made. And if I stop it and then play again, it just brings it right back up to where it is because it's reading automation on there. So if you need to change the volume or pretty much any parameter value, if you have automation, you need to use this trim option right here. You click and drag up and down, and it'll move all of the automation up and down and keep your relative changes, which is super useful. So all right, let's bring this back to where we had it roughly. So one last thing to go over is just deleting all the automation on a track. So obviously you can click and drag all of it and delete it that way, but if you have a 4-minute track and maybe you just want to redo all the automation, it can be kind of difficult to select everything. So you can right click in the gray area of the track, not on this picture here. It'll give you that option there, but in this gray area, you can delete visible automation or delete all automation. Now, if we had other automation, let's just jump back to our feedback, add this. So if you had multiple automation on there and you want to delete all of them, you could just right click, delete all automation. Or if you only delete visible, it'll only delete what you're looking at. So we can still see that feedback automation in the background there. And then I'll undo that there. And then the key commands for that is Control Command Delete will do just visible. It'll delete visible. And then Shift Control Command Delete will delete all the automation on there. So now that we've gone over sort of the basics there, let's jump over to a track that I made from last video, and then we'll take a look at some practical uses of automation in your composing and mixing stages. All right, so now that we've gone over the basics of automation, let's jump over to a track. This is the little doodle I made from the last video. I played the whole thing in the last video. If you want to check that out, I'm just going to play kind of portions of it here. I'll play a little bit right now for you. So, all right, so a couple things I want to go over before we really dive into the automation that I've done here is, so if we double click on any MIDI region to bring up our piano roll, if I press A here, it's going to bring up the actual MIDI automation. And now MIDI automation is going to be separate from track automation. And we have a little drop-down menu here, which acts the same as our drop-down menus that we showed in the last bit, where on MIDI automation, you're basically going to be working mostly with like modulation, note velocity, or like pitch bend, things like that. So for example, this chord stab has modulation automation, which makes it vibrato here. And I can move these nodes around the same as I could on the track automation, and then select them the same way as well. And then also take note real quick, this is just a slight little tip, is if you notice this blue outline on this window here, it means that I'm currently working in this window. So if I press A, it's going to bring up that Midi automation in and out the view. If I click up here, it's going to highlight in blue this window up here. And if I press A, it'll bring up the automation on my actual tracks. So just take note of that. Now, another big thing of automation that you're going to run into is moving automation when you're moving your MIDI regions. So for example, like this ARP video game, which has a bunch of volume automation on it. If I click up here in this highlighted top part and move this track over, Logic will ask me, do you want to move the track automation data? So if I say move, it'll actually move that automation with it. Whereas if I try and move it and say don't move, it'll leave that automation there. And then if I replace that with a MIDI region, it'll then have that automation there for that. I would say that box, that kind of warning box, is very annoying, and you can tell it to not show the message anymore, but I would recommend leaving it on there because sometimes you do want to move it, sometimes you don't want to move it, just kind of depending on what you're doing. So until you kind of really get a grasp of what you're doing, I'd still recommend that every time you move something, it actually gives you that warning. And actually, speaking of this ARP video game, we can take a look at the automation I did for that. So I'll zoom in just a little bit. So you can see I have volume on here, and I have it so it's dropping out on each hit. So it's only playing during those hits here. And I'll just solo a couple of these so you can hear them. And so alone. And if I didn't have that, it would just bleed into each of those sections. So let me turn these back on. So it really just kind of tightens up that drop. So you kind of have those pause breathing moments. And that's just one example of kind of how you can use automation to add some dynamics and sort of like character to your parts. So another thing I did, and this is kind of a big one, is going to be on this chord pad here. And I'll show you the automation. So I got some automation here where the volume drops out at the end to allow for the drum hit at the end. And if I click on this, we can see the other ones. I have a few other ones on here. Specifically the RetroSynth cutoff. I have the cutoff rising. Now let's actually open RetroSynth to see what's happening here. And so watch the cutoff on this filter. And I basically just turned, I believe it's this here that you'll see moving up and down. Or no, I'm sorry, you'll see the actual cutoff moving up and down. Whoop. And so it creates that sort of rising effect that goes into the verse. And so, you can, I just did that by going into RetroSynth, and then here's once again menu diving, filter, and then cutoff. Or you could just use the touch or latch and then grab this, move it, and then it'll give you your automation like I was showing you in the previous thing. And then kind of all together, it kind of adds this nice build. Sorry about some crazy delay going on. And so, you can also use it, so like let's say at the end of this drop here. So let's say I wanted the lead to echo out after here. So we'll just do this real quick. So we're gonna press A for our automation. So right now we have the volume of it going down because I think I originally had this note extended outward. But if I want this to delay, I'll keep it short. And then let's see here. We don't have a tape delay on here, so we'll add a tape delay. And Actually, I already got it right here, tape delay. And then I want the wet of this. So there's a couple things here, and this is why automation can get kind of confusing. So what we want to do is I only want the tape delay on this one note here to delay out, just as an example. And so if I turn this to touch or latch, I'll just jump on touch here real quick. And I'm just going to move whatever parameters I want. So I know I want to affect the feedback, and I only want it on this part. So I can also turn this off and on to create a bypass automation. And so you saw that jump up here, insert 6, bypass tape delay. You can also access this from this menu. If you go to main, and then you can access all of your bypasses for each of those plugins. But this is also just a quick way of doing it. And then I also want feedback. Or actually, let's do wet. And we can keep our feedback pretty high because we're only doing it for this note. So I now bring this back to read. Don't forget to bring that back to read. So I now have our bypass, which this is binary. The bypass is just up and down. If you create a node, it just goes up and down to either off or on. So we want to bypass everywhere except for right here. And that last note, we'll bring that over. It doesn't play again, but I'll just go ahead and bypass it anyway in case I end up adding more lead later. And then for our wet, we'll just get rid of this. And then we can click and drag up on that note. And I kind of want to catch it right before the note starts. And we can also kind of fade this out because the volume that you can see faded in the background ends here. So I can just sort of do this in a similar manner and have it end there. And let's just take a listen and see how this sounds. That's pretty subtle. Let's listen solo. And so if you hear there, we caught that high note there too. So we'll bring our wet over. Let's bring our feedback up a little bit. Still catching that. Bring this over. It really likes that top note. And you'll do this a lot where you're just adjusting things and you realize like, wait, this is nowhere near that note. Why is it catching it? And that's how it goes. Perhaps we'll move our bypass over so it's only hitting there. There we go. It was in our actual bypass of that. And then we can actually bring this back over. And let's see if we hear that in the mix. There's a lot going on here. Yeah, so it's subtle, but you know, it's the subtleties that add up. It's those little details that will kind of add up and create that sort of like wall of sound, that kind of lush overall sound design that you're creating. So that's just one example there. Let's see what else we have. So this filter here. So this is a big one. This will kind of be the last one that I go over here. Now, this here is actually an aux. So I briefly talked about buses and auxes in Synthwave Series 5 in the organization basics. So if I hit X to bring up my mixer, I have a bunch of my bus groups going into filter. So like my drums are going there, my synths are not, the bass is, and the FX is. And if I go over here to my filter, it is being directed directly to stereo out. So basically, these main groups are going through the filter, which then go to stereo out. And so I have that filter aux showing here. So I can add automation to that filter. Now I have auto filter and flanger on here right now. And if I press A to show that, you can see I have the cutoff of the auto filter going down during this buildup, and then the flanger is doing its thing as well. And then I have a bypass of the flanger, so the flanger is only happening right here. I didn't have one for the filter because if it's on and I have the cutoff all the way up, on that filter, it's not really making a difference or a noticeable difference. So I just kind of kept it as is. Oh, the filter was never even on. And it creates that kind of dynamic, interesting sort of sound for that rising into the actual drop. Now, you may have kind of noticed and might be wondering, why do I have this MIDI region here? Because if I delete this MIDI region, this automation could still exist without that, and I can still play, it'll sound the same. But the reason I have that region there is because, now let's say I'm working on this track, and let's say I want to add a whole intro to this. So I just, Command A, grab everything, and I just move everything over. And then, yes, I want to move all the MIDI automation of all this stuff here. But if you take note, the MIDI automation from filter did not move. So now my buildup is happening randomly here in the little verse section. And so that's why we will often create MIDI regions and place them wherever we have automation data. So then if we move the whole track, it will move that automation along with it. This is sort of like a little pro tip from us here, because it's super useful. It can be kind of annoying, especially if you're... actually, here's another example. The stereo out doesn't have a MIDI region. I have it dropping... I'm just going to go back here. I have it dropping 3 dB right before, and actually this is a perfect example. It's not even doing it in the correct area. This is supposed to be doing this drop here right before it actually kicks in to the drop. So it goes down 3 dB and then bumps up 3 dB when the drop hits. So it's just a little louder. Just kind of, bursts out, and seems a little off time there. Yeah, I could tell. Bring this right there. So you would ideally have a MIDI region down here as well. Let me adjust my view to see this a little better. So it begins here and then ends there. So we can just right click, create MIDI region, and then bring this right there. So then now, if I select everything, no matter where I move, these tracks move, we now have that automation moving along with it. And so that's going to be pretty much it for this video. If you guys want to see more about automation or more about some different things that you can do with it, we can dive into that. But we'll finish it up for now so we don't go too over time. And leave a comment, any feedback you have. Drop a like, subscribe to us if you're enjoying the videos. Hopefully we'll keep this ball rolling, and we'll see you next time. Stay rad.